Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for being with us today. I'm Mary Mazzoni, Senior Editor of Triple Pundit, and we're here for another edition of the 3BL Forum Brands Taking Stands Live. We're so excited for this conversation about how business can step up and play a role in the fight against climate change. As we've seen from this summer of droughts, flooding, wildfires, heat waves, the impacts of the climate crisis are here with us today. And the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change confirms that they're intensifying. But what's often lost in these headlines about climate impacts is that we're fortunate enough to be part of the generation that still has a chance to do something about this. The science tells us that we still have a chance to avert the worst impacts of the climate crisis if we take bold, decisive action now. Today, we're speaking with a stellar lineup of business leaders about the private sector's role in pushing climate action forward in the lead up to the COP26 climate talks and beyond. First, last week I was joined by Thomas Lingard, the Global Sustainability Director of Unilever, who we thank so much again for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you all today.
I have so many questions I'd like to ask you, so I'm just going to dive right in. We've all heard so much about the IPCC's sixth assessment report, which came out last month. I'm wondering what your take is on the findings of the report and specifically what they mean for business.
Yeah, well, look, I think everybody, saw the headlines when that report came out, and many of us have been following those reports, for years as the IPCC has done its critically important work. And I think we could maybe have predicted the direction of travel, because every time we get one of these reports, we learn that it's even more certain what's going on. It's happening even faster, and it's definitely caused by human interactions with the environment. And so I suppose I was maybe less taken aback than many others, but it is certainly a massive wake-up call for the last remaining people who are not on the bus on the climate emergency, in terms of really getting going with taking the action that we need to take. I regretted a bit, there was a lot of doom and gloom. You get a lot of doomism around these reports, that it's all too late, there's nothing we can do. We absolutely don't think that's true. We think there is a window to act. We can still keep the 1.5 degree temperature rise in check, but we do have to all move now, and we have to do things that we haven't been doing in the past. So it was a wake-up call for anyone still sleeping, and further incentives to get going for everybody else.
Absolutely. And I love what you're saying about this positive outlook, about how we still have time to act, and looking ahead to the next big milestone here, COP26 in Glasgow, the meetings that will be happening there. Unilever is actually the principal partner of COP26. I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit more about what that means for Unilever.
Yeah, for sure. And, we've been participating in COPs for many years now. And COPs are so important because they are the political meetings where world leaders get together to try and forge a path through on this tricky issue. And I think if we learned anything about climate change, is that it's not just an environmental issue. It's a political issue about how we transform the way our societies run, where we get energy from, the sorts of things we tax and don't tax, and incentivize how we get governments, businesses, civil society to work together in this enormous transition that we're all trying to do. So, COPs are really unique as a place that brings every country together, every country with an equal voice, whether you're a rich developed country or a small island state that's maybe extremely vulnerable to climate change. And I think we're learning more that this vulnerability is no longer just something that happens to poorer countries far away. This is a vulnerability that people in the US are experiencing now, and Europe are experiencing as the extreme weather starts to bite. So these are incredibly important political moments, and I think over the years the business and the politics has come closer together through the COPs. People have started to see that it's very difficult for governments to act in isolation. It's also very difficult for companies to act in isolation. Companies are increasingly prepared to make bold commitments, and you see increasing numbers of people coming forwards with net zero ambition and science-based targets, saying we really are going to do our best to achieve these dramatic reductions in emissions. But we can only do that if we get the kind of policy support from governments at a national and an international level. So our partnership with the UK presidency of COP26 is all about trying to further rally high ambition from businesses and from governments in the run up to that COP. We're looking for countries to set updated national climate plans, NDCs in the language, nationally determined contributions, as well as short-term milestones and the sorts of policies that will give some credibility to those plans as well, whether that's carbon pricing, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, land use policies, and so on. So it's an incredibly important moment, and we're working very closely, as I say, with the UK presidency to make that as successful as it can be.
Absolutely. I love, again, what you're saying about this synergy between business action and government action and how those two can really come together to bring the movement forward that we really need right now. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what Unilever in particular is doing and what your plans are to cut your own emissions.
Yeah, for sure. And, sustainability, we always say, begins at home. And for a long time, we've had programs in place around our own operational emissions. We set a goal. Most recent goal for that was in 2015. We said we would aim to reduce by 100% the emissions from our own operations by 2030. And that's not with any offsetting or anything. That's just by shifting energy sources from fossil fuel sources to renewable sources. We were delighted that last year we achieved that for our power consumption worldwide. So we now have 100% renewable grid electricity coming from renewable sources. And now our next big challenge is thermal energy, heat in our factories, where we're through a mixture of efficiency and biogenics and hydrogen pilots, even starting to look at how we might get to zero emissions from heat too. But of course, in a consumer goods business, and indeed in many businesses, the emissions are not so much in your own operations, but are up and downstream in the value chain. We have a long-standing target to try and halve the footprint of our products right across the value chain by 2030. We had a sort of a rocky start in the early 2010s, but we're making really good progress with that now. And last year, we also set a new target to achieve net zero emissions from all of our products by 2039. And we wanted to signal also that the importance of these long-term net zero signals in galvanizing action, in really shifting people's thinking that this is not just an incremental change you can do by shaving a little bit of emissions off each year. This is really about transformative thinking about how we re-engineer a business for a zero carbon world. We've done other things too. Our brands, particularly coming to the fore as this becomes more salient for consumers. We have a new €1 billion climate and nature fund that we've committed from our brands to invest in climate and nature solutions over the next decade that will both have meaningful impacts on climate and nature, but also be very visible to consumers. When they're in the supermarket or shopping online, it'll be clear what these brands are doing with that money to address deforestation, landscape restoration, wildlife protection, and even water preservation, all things linked to climate and nature. So we've got some great work coming there. And we've also made commitments around eliminating deforestation from our supply chains. That's a really tricky systemic issue for the consumer goods industry and anyone else using agricultural commodities. But we set a 2023 deadline for that, and we're doing great stuff across palm oil, tea, soy, cocoa supply chains, paper and board. And our sustainable sourcing colleagues are working tirelessly there to re-engineer supply chains using digital technologies for traceability, and really, just trying to make sure we know where everything's coming from and that we're convinced and assured that it's deforestation free.
Well, thank you so much for that rundown, and congratulations on this renewable energy milestone. Great to learn more about what you all have planned for the road ahead. But as you mentioned, COP26, where we're looking at now, is really, it's all about governments coming together in a unique way to hopefully promote stronger climate policies. And we know that Unilever is also very active in this area, really using your influence to advocate for climate-friendly policies at the government level. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about this as well.
Yeah, I think, this has been, again, a really important area for us. We've been active in the policy space for a number of years, primarily at the COPs and in the international fora. But I think post the Paris Agreement, we have the framework now, and what we need is to see the ambition from individual countries, to see that the international ambition and the agreements that the Paris Agreement represents is translated into national policies, frameworks and plans. So we've been doing great work with our teams all around the world in different national capitals, briefing them on climate policy and getting them ready to engage with national governments as we head towards COP26. That work is underway. It's really about getting into some of the policy specifics. Carbon pricing is one that's often talked about, but also removal of fossil fuel subsidies, forestry programs, and emissions trading regulations, and so on, are all going to be very important for driving the shift at the speed we want to see it. Very important area. I think it's an area that companies often find hard. The policy engagement piece, I think it depends where you are in the world, but many companies don't want to stick their necks out, particularly if you have a situation where climate is politicized at all, and it can be a tricky issue to speak out on. But we're encouraged that we're seeing more and more people saying, well, look, we can't be silent on this any longer. We can't not raise our voices as businesses. This is now a business issue. This isn't a case of a political belief or a moral issue. It's a business issue that unless action is taken on climate change, our business is going to suffer. It's just straight economics at this point. And I think we're seeing people pay much more attention to the role of trade associations and lobbying. How much money is flowing into different organizations, what positions they're taking, what impact that's having on the policy. Brilliant work from NGOs like Influence Map are starting to really trace which organizations are kind of leading for climate action and which are holding it back, and which companies are attached to those. And we're very supportive of the work that groups like that are doing to shine a spotlight on some of the negative policy influencing that goes on, as well as the proactive stuff that companies like Unilever are trying to drive.
Absolutely. I would definitely recommend our audience check out some of the work that Influence Map has done on this. There's really a lot to be learned there, just in terms of what's happening now and where we could be headed. And I'm wondering, you did mention that this can be a kind of a tough area for businesses. I'm wondering if you have any advice for business leaders that may also be looking to really leverage the influence of their companies to push stronger climate action policies forward.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I think, in boardrooms, you sometimes hear that people are saying, well, what are the shareholders going to say? What are the investors going to say if I, start going down this track? We wanted to make sure that we had a pretty good sense that our investors were behind us. But, there's this big trend for these sort of advisory votes at AGMs, at annual general meetings now, on climate transition plans. And we wanted to be a bit ahead of the trend on that. So in May this year, we submitted a Unilever climate transition action plan to our shareholders. We talked about everything that we've talked about just now, the stuff we're doing in our operations, through our value chain, our brands, and our policy influence, and how we wanted to drive that through our sort of policy engagement. And we set that all out and said, this is what we're going to do, yes or no. And we got an astonishing 99.59% approval in the votes cast. A resounding endorsement from our shareholders and investors that they support the direction we're going, and they support the kind of work that we're doing. And I think that if we needed it, that's an incredibly emboldening move for leaders in our own organization to know that the full spectrum of stakeholders have got our back in the work we're trying to do.
That's really a powerful finding, and I would say that it's encouraging for others out there to hear that maybe if you are going to jump into the fray on some of these issues, that it might be friendlier than you might imagine. And that's great to know. But as we leave our audience here, I'm wondering if you have any other thoughts, just if there's one thing that you might want business leaders out there to know about the urgency of this moment we're in right now, leading up to COP26 and beyond, what might that be?
Well, look, I don't think you need me to stress the urgency. You just need to pick up a newspaper if you've got any questions about that. I mean, the one thing I would say is I think people massively underestimate their influence as leaders, as business leaders, and you don't have to be the CEO to be a business leader. You can be at any level in the organization, but the power that organizations have, not only through their own operations, and I think that's where people have been focused. But to speak out, to empower employees, to educate, to involve investors and other stakeholders, to speak to policymakers. That, as I said at the beginning, this isn't so much an environmental problem as a socio-political one now, and every business has agency in that context. And I think we need to see more activism from businesses and people in business, because they can bring a really pragmatic point of view to how this transition can happen. So I think some optimism that we can do this, and some pragmatism from the business community of how we're going to make it happen.
That's great. Thank you so much. And great note to leave our audience here on. You don't have to be a CEO to be a leader, and you can really use your influence, and we can do this. So I think that that's so great. And thank you so much again, Thomas, for taking the time to be with us today. We really enjoyed hearing your perspective.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Love it. I'm such a huge fan of Thomas's real undercurrent of hopefulness because, despondence is only going to lead to inaction, and inaction is the absolute last thing that we need to see right now. And in that spirit of action, next, my colleague Leon Kay is joined by leaders from Netflix and NG Impact to talk a little more about how companies can set meaningful net zero targets that meet the urgency of the moment we're in.
Thanks for joining, everybody. I'm Leon Kay, Executive Editor at Triple Pundit. And joining me at this moment is Emma Stewart. She is Netflix's Sustainability Officer. And also joining us is Clinton Maloney. He is the Managing Director of Sustainability Solutions at NG Impact. So let's go ahead and dive in right now. Emma, why don't you start off? Could you walk us through Netflix's net zero strategy and what your targets are?
Sure, it'd be my pleasure. Netflix plus nature is the name of our target, which is to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the end of 2022, so next year. And what that entails is a combination of science-driven internal emissions reductions, coupled with investments in the power of nature to stabilize the climate.
So that's interesting because most of these net zero goals I've heard is 2030, but you're have your targets on sites on next year, correct? Did I hear you correctly? Correct. All right. So then Clinton, so you're working closely with Netflix on this strategy. Tell us about the process.
Sure. Well, Emma has mentioned a really important key word, and that's science-based. So part of the work that we've been doing with Emma and with Netflix is making sure that they have that scientific basis to ensure that her ambition and Netflix's ambition around net zero really is very well founded, in fact. So how do we assemble those facts in a way across a very distributed business that lets us know where to focus and how to move quickly? I'd say that's the first piece. And then the second piece in terms of our work with Emma is really supporting some of their other key elements of the ambition around what to take responsibility for. So, Emma and Netflix's approach is, when in doubt, take responsibility for that part of the footprint. And that's required us to look at, how do we make sure that we've got the scientific basis to do those things and that we're making good choices.
So that's interesting. The science-based part truly is important, but I have to admit, I'm a little stuck on this 2022. It's really ambitious. So Emma, how do you plan to make this vision a reality?
Well, so we apply a framework that I actually use with my own family, which is we take our household and we try to optimize, then electrify, and then decarbonize. So OED. And what does that mean? So optimize means eliminating waste, squeezing out energy and fuel that we don't need to use. And so for our own home, as an example, we put in LED lighting. We did an energy audit to understand what equipment upgrades we could do. And what that did was saved us money on our utility bill. Then secondly, we electrified where we could. So we swapped out our hybrid car for an electric car. Now my children enjoy charging the car, which was not something they could do with a fuel-powered car. And then as a third step, we decarbonized the electricity that serves both our house and now our car. So OED. The same applies to Netflix. We're applying this rubric in a step change fashion. So wherever possible, we're looking for energy efficiency, optimization of fleet, optimization of schedule, as well as opportunities to upgrade equipment. As one example, in the production business, lighting is really important. And what we've seen is an embrace of LED lighting, which is about 75% more energy efficient than the conventional bulbs, but also produces less heat, which means we have to spend less energy cooling the space. And because it expends less heat, the makeup doesn't melt quite as badly for our cast, for our talent. So it's kind of a win-win-win. That's one example. And then secondly, we're electrifying where possible our fleets, both on the back end for our productions and offering free electric vehicle charging to our employees. And then we're decarbonizing what energy is left, the energy that is unavoidable that we need to use, by buying cleaner energy through renewable energy credits, through local utilities, and where necessary, investing directly in clean energy projects.
I've got to tell you, I've heard a lot of plans and quite frankly pitches about these net zero plans. I haven't heard one yet talking about how somebody is saying how this is what we're doing at home and this is how we're applying it company wide. So this is quite exciting, and I'm not just saying that because I just finished binge watching Never Have I Ever. But anyhow, Clinton, so I'm curious, you've worked with a number of top companies on climate strategies. So help us wrap our heads around this. How did that experience, prior experience, inform the strategy that you've been developing with Netflix?
Yeah, so I would say our view, Leon, when it comes to what works in terms of strategy is very much informed about, you've got to have the great plan, but the way in which you put that plan together has got to make implementation inevitable, right? So we are not working with Emma on putting together a very detailed plan that sits on the shelf. We are working with her to mobilize the organization against these very ambitious targets that she is supporting. And so that is, I think, a distinctive view on strategy, that we're looking to create a movement inside all of the clients that we work with so that folks know how their job or role needs to shift in order to support the net zero ambition and agenda. So, some of the things that we're supporting Emma on today, including looking at some very interesting technologies that will be a key piece of the decarbonization agenda. So, how do you find those technologies? How do you evaluate those? How quickly can you get those deployed? Because I think the genius about the strategy that Emma has created and is following is because net zero has to happen at 2022, it means that everything you're doing today is immediate. It's not the next person's job to figure out how to do it. It's all of the people you're working with today. And Emma has a vast ecosystem of suppliers and partners that she works with. And having that ambition with a very tight deadline means that they are now working immediately in supporting that agenda. And we're just seeing all kinds of innovations occur, Leon. And to me, that is the genius of this strategy. It's some clear ideas, a focus on implementation and mobilization, and extending to that ecosystem to drive innovation so that Emma can get the kind of technology she needs at prices that make sense.
So I'm curious, so got a really compressed time frame here. So as Emma, I'd like to know, as you're acting on the strategy and implementing it, what do you see as one of the first big action items for reducing or even eliminating Netflix's emissions?
Well, for the entertainment sector, to give you a sense, and NG helped us measure our carbon footprint. So I can highly recommend to anyone who hasn't done that baby step. NG is one of the best in the business. And so call them immediately. What we found from measuring across 2 different years to get a nicely representative set of years was that the physical production of film and television shows was 50 to 60%, depending upon the year, of the total carbon footprint. And that's in part because we took, as Clinton was saying, we took responsibility for any title that was then branded as Netflix, even if we didn't have direct operational control over that show's physical production. So what that does is focuses the mind that we need to look at the internal reductions associated with physical production. And where are the emissions coming from there? They're coming largely from fuel and electricity. And in what format is that? Well, it's heating, lighting, cooling, and in particular, the use of diesel generators, which are prevalent across the entertainment and construction and events industry, and bring a lot of flexibility, but also bring a lot of, frankly, unclean air and a lot of noise, which is a no-no in production. You really want to try and allow your crew to be as agile as possible with these technologies, and the noise and the fumes from diesel generators don't stack up. So diesel generators, replacing those with clean mobile battery or potentially green hydrogen solutions, and then bringing in charging infrastructure and rolling out over time electric vehicles for the different vehicle types that we need for transportation. And then when it comes to electrifying and supplying the electricity for those vehicles or those batteries, it's securing cleaner power from the local utility, or where necessary and where that's not available, directly investing in clean energy projects.
So one of you alluded to earlier how Netflix has this very strong nature-based element within its strategy that's centered around investments that both retain and even remove carbon. So Clinton, we've really seen no shortage of corporate carbon offset schemes, projects out there. What do you see as setting Netflix's vision apart from others that are out there?
Yeah, so and this has been a big topic of conversation, and we've put a lot of, I think, horsepower behind making very good choices in this space. So to me, what sets Netflix's approach apart is its net zero plus nature. So a couple things. Nature-based stories, as they connect to climate, are the kinds of things that we know that Netflix subscribers are really consuming. So how the human species addresses climate change going forwards is the story of the decade. It is the most important story that we're involved in, and Netflix is, I think, helping lead the way in giving people access to that story. So there's a really clear connection, I think, between the strategy that Emma has laid out and then needing to invest in really high quality nature-based solutions that either retain or remove carbon from the atmosphere. And then our role in supporting Emma with that is around the procurement process. So there are carbon markets that operate today, but what you need to remember, Leon, is that you are making an investment in an underlying project. And you really have to understand the way that that underlying project is framed, what it actually delivers. And we look to make sure that those projects are anchored in some of the very high quality frameworks that give us confidence that the removal and the retention is permanent, additional, like all of those things that give you confidence that you're actually addressing the fundamental challenge. And that's the work that we do, is to help Emma sort through that vast ecosystem and make high quality choices that then also connect back to the nature strategy, which I think has been a very exciting part of our relationship.
That's great. So look, I wish we could go on about this longer. I wish we had more time, but we're going to have to wrap up. So I'm going to give each of you about 45 seconds-ish. So Emma, so let's just wrap this up. How does Netflix, give us an example of how Netflix is ensuring its carbon retention and removal strategies. How are they making these meaningful?
Yeah, so we actually established a 5-step evaluation process, which we then open sourced. So for anyone who is interested in adopting that or critiquing it, that's available at sustainability.netflix.com. And if you go to the Net Zero Launch blog, there is a technical blog there that walks you through that exhaustive 5-step process, which we don't have time for today, but which is available. And I would just urge people also to think about how to do this collectively, because it is quite time consuming and expensive for an individual company to run the millions and millions of potential tons out there in carbon credits through these 5 steps. And so we've actually teamed up with other companies under a group called BASC at Business for Social Responsibility in order to share our best practices with one another.
So then looking back, you're obviously taking on a lot right now, but there's still more work that needs to be done after 2022. So Emma, what are your plans for your company to plan to continue cutting emissions?
Well, our combination of a science-based target with a net zero target means that we're never off the hook. So a science-based target at the earliest is a 2030 target by definition. A net zero target is an annual commitment in perpetuity. So this is not a one-off. Every year we have to find those reductions using that optimize, electrify, decarbonize framework. And every year we then have to compensate with these high quality carbon credits for any unavoidable emissions, which are largely in our scope 3 as they are for so many companies. And the good news is that the cost curve for batteries, for solar, for wind are dropping so precipitously that I feel like we have a clean tech wind at our back, if you will. The economics are heading in the right direction. And so actually business as usual is starting to look quite expensive compared to the greener alternative. And similarly, we're hoping to capitalize on what I would say is now the inevitable electrification of transportation. And in our sector, we're seeking to accelerate that.
Great. You know what, Clinton, I want to wrap up with you quickly. Looking beyond just looking beyond this year, can you give us a quick piece of advice for business leaders that are looking to go after meaningful net zero topics? 1 or 2 quick action items, please.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Leon. So first of all, if you've not looked at the business case for net zero in the last 24 months, everything has changed. It is entirely possible to make a net zero commitment while also being a very good fiduciary around your company's assets and financial position. So as Emma was saying, these things really are going arm in arm today. So that's point number 1. And point number 2 is, really pay attention to stakeholders. So we're just hearing from the financial community, from customers, from employees, that this is once seen as an optional business strategy, but it doesn't feel very optional anymore. So what I would encourage people to do is to dive in with the level of boldness that Emma and Netflix has done, because she's uncovering all kinds of sources of business value. By engaging with her ecosystem, there's all kinds of innovations that are coming to light. And now's the moment. Like, if you look at the IPCC report, there is no time to waste, and there's a lot that can be accomplished by diving in.
Fantastic. So again, to learn more about Netflix's sustainability strategy, go to sustainability.netflix.com. That's a wrap. Again, I'm Leon Kay. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll continue in a bit.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leon.
Wow, I feel like that one could have gone on so much longer. So interesting to hear about what's going into Netflix's specific net zero plan. And I love what both Emma and Clinton are saying about how this is not a one-off. This is not something you can set and forget. This is really an annual commitment to reducing emissions as much as possible, and then meaningfully offsetting emissions you can't avoid, and committing to continue to keep getting better. To switch gears a little bit though, away from energy, transportation, a lot of people don't really realize that the global food system produces 25% or even more of global greenhouse gas emissions, depending on the estimate. And so now we're excited to invite Rebecca Moses, who is the head of impact strategy for Impossible Foods, and Caroline Bushnell, who is the vice president of corporate engagement for the Good Food Institute. So thank you, ladies, so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Our pleasure, absolutely. So to kick things off here, Impossible Foods launched in 2011 with a really audacious vision to shake up the global food system and dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Rebecca, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about this to kick things off.
Absolutely. Well, Impossible Foods was founded to turn back the clock on climate change. That's the business model. We happen to go about doing that by making meat from plants. So here's a little background on that. We all know, and we've heard this whole morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, we're in 2 emergencies right now. We're in a climate emergency, and we're in an extinction emergency, loss of nature, loss of wildlife. And those 2 things are very, very much related. So there's no way to address them without addressing global meat consumption. You mentioned something in the intro about direct emissions coming from agriculture. The vast majority of that is coming from animal farming, not just agriculture in general, but the land use component of it is as important as those direct emissions. This is probably the most under-acknowledged climate impact area, the land use of livestock, so particularly cattle. It really is catastrophic for our ability collectively to pull and keep carbon out of the atmosphere. So half of the world's surface is grazed or is in feed crop production. That's an incredible erosion, not only of nature, but really a loss of carbon storing vegetation. And that's not even getting into that direct emissions question. So this is the current situation. And over the next several decades, meat consumption is projected to nearly double. What does that mean in terms of our ability to keep, human beings within these planetary thresholds? So very simply, Dr. Pat Brown founded Impossible Foods in 2011 because this is a policy vacuum. It's very, very underaddressed. We have to find ways to get consumers to reduce their reliance on animal farming by eating less meat from animals. And we have to do that drastically, but not by trying to bully or cajole people into changing food practices. because it's pretty ineffective. So just to sum up, we make, as a company at Impossible Foods, we make meat using ingredients from plants, things like soy, sunflower, coconut, and our own iron-carrying ingredient heme. And that is to provide a climate and land use toolkit for consumers so that they don't have to compromise in their food choice, but they can make a sustainable choice. So the Impossible Burger requires 96% less land, about 89% less greenhouse gas emissions results from it. And it's great if consumer knows that, but they don't have to know it to enjoy the product.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And the Good Food Institute is closely tracking this, closely tracking the development of alternative proteins, as well as how consumers are feeling about them. So Caroline, I'm wondering if you can kick things off by telling us a little more about who GFI is and what you're seeing out there as far as consumer sentiment around meatless meat alternative protein.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, GFI, or the Good Food Institute, we're a nonprofit 501c3, and we're really focused on reimagining protein for all of the reasons that Rebecca just really wonderfully described. Right. So we're focused on developing the roadmap for a sustainable, secure, and just food system. And so to do that, we really focus on alternative proteins as a long-term, durable solution. It's sustainable, market-based, and really well-positioned to help us meet global climate goals. And as Rebecca said, without asking consumers, to give up products they love or completely change their behaviors. Instead, we're focused on using alternative proteins. And when I say that, I'm talking about plant-based products like the Impossible Burger, but also products that are produced through fermentation and even cultivated meat, which for those not familiar, is actually cultivating animal muscle cells outside of the animal to produce animal meat, just without the need for raising livestock or slaughter, and all of the negative environmental impacts and externalities as Rebecca was discussing. So together, these three platforms really allow us to make the meat that consumers love, just in a better way. And ultimately, we're really working to make the climate-friendly choice the default choice for consumers through our three key areas of work, which include corporate engagement, science and technology, and policy. So that's kind of a high level about GFI. To touch on the consumer sentiment piece, there's actually 2 articles about alternative proteins in the New York Times today. So you're talking just about both for the more kind of conventional land-based alternative protein products, but also one focusing on alternative seafood, with just massively increasing consumer interest in this space, right? And so we've reached the point where, these are no longer products for just vegans or vegetarians. And that's due both to kind of the game-changing innovation we've seen from Impossible Foods and other companies in the space, really looking to recapitulate meat from plant or through these other technologies, but often also shifting consumer needs and values and kind of the generational changes we're seeing with millennials and Gen Z in particular, and their concern about environmental choices. So, now we've got traditional meat eaters and flexitarians as the market for these products as well.
Absolutely. And Rebecca, I'm wondering what you're seeing as far as how consumer attitudes have shifted around this since Impossible launched, a decade ago.
There's definitely been a pretty meaningful shift. I've been at Impossible for 5 years, and it's been apparent even in that time frame. So I think that shift has occurred kind of on 2 fronts. That first front is probably, and Carolyn was alluding to both of these. The first front is consumer appetite for addressing sustainability in their purchase choice, addressing climate change and kind of how they make choices, and that has really increased. I'll credit a lot of that, I think, to youth movements. Starting around 2019, it has really reached kind of a peak in a way that it didn't until the past couple of years. So in marketing speak, sustainability credibility is moving consumers down that purchasing funnel, and it's bringing them back to repeat purchase, which is interesting. So if brands can communicate that, that's something that can add a lot of value. But the second front, and this is very specific to our sector, is that consumer awareness of what we internally call plate to planet is increasing. For decades, there's been a pretty low global awareness of the impacts of food and food categories on climate at the consumer level. And research has shown that about 1/3, like 30% or so of people can make that connection between, the category of food that's on my plate and the climate, there's a connection there. And we started getting really interested in this because we know that consumers are motivated by sustainability increasingly over the past couple of years. But if they don't know how to connect their choices and their wallets to their values, that's a huge opportunity gap for, mobilizing consumers for climate action. So we started doing some of our own research on this and found that two things seem to be happening. The first is that consumers are more likely now to be able to recognize that red meat is associated with very, very high emissions, exponentially higher emissions than any other food category. The second thing is that the consumers that know that or can recognize it at some level actually happen to eat less red meat in their diets. And that, that was huge for us, and it goes way beyond selling Impossible burgers. If we want to address climate change and extinction collectively, we've got to start educating consumers on what really moves the needle. And showing the trade-offs in choosing beef from cows is a big part of, I think, the action toolkit that we as a sector should start thinking about more.
Thanks so much for that rundown. I think that's super helpful for us all to just wrap our heads around where people's thinking is right now and how they're feeling about this. And as we look toward COP26 of this decade of action for addressing the climate crisis, I'm wondering what you all see as really the key action items for companies in the global food sector in order to really move some of these solutions forward. Caroline, I'd love to start with you and hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, as Rebecca alluded to, we won't be able to get to net zero emissions without addressing food and land. Right. So the food sector has to be a part of the solution. And we believe, alternative proteins are really a key aspect of how we do that. So considering, portfolio compositions and making sure that brands are identifying opportunities to move into, alternative meat, egg, and dairy products. And also, right, food companies need to disclose greenhouse gas emissions, report science-based targets, and outline their progress towards those targets. And they really need to include Scope 3 emissions. The nonprofit series actually just put out a report where they refer to these value chain emissions as the Achilles heel of the food sector. And they looked at about the top 50 food companies. I don't know exactly how they rated them, but they found only 19 of those even disclosed Scope 3 emissions, and only 15 had science-based targets set.
Wow, that is a pretty stark disparity there. Rebecca, I'm wondering what you see as some of those action items. It's clear that we've got a long way to go when it comes to this sector, and that the sector absolutely does have a role to play.
Yeah, I think there's so much room for improvement. There's so many things we could be doing. One of, I think my personal pet peeves is within these dialogues, we have to start getting more specific, and we have to start getting more prescriptive. So when we talk about the emissions of agriculture, let's drill down one more level. Let's talk about animal agriculture and what percentage that constitutes. It is the vast majority. When we talk about deforestation, and we talk about deforestation from soy-driven deforestation is entirely to feed livestock. So these are things that we have to go down into the consumption level, the root cause, and get consumers into this equation in a way that we haven't. I'd also say that, and GFI has been a huge leader in this, more innovation in the supply chains for meat from plants, for other types of alternative proteins, finding ways to get a bigger, more robust toolkit to steer away from animal farming. And not just in rich countries. And that's the other thing I'd really double click on is there's been a lot of movement, a lot of investment in the global north. There needs to be more, I think, more broadly, and that is something that is emerging. I touched a little bit around kind of awareness building, consumer understanding of Plate to Planet. That is a big opportunity area. And, I think finally, I don't hold out a huge amount of hope for this, but within the NDCs, it would be great to see some policy determinations around this issue, but it does tend to be a tough one to get through in terms of policy.
Definitely, from the policy side, that's definitely what we've seen through the course of our reporting. But I love what you're saying here about specificity, because I think that that's such a huge issue in the sustainability space, right, in general, which already is a very broad term that could mean so many different things. So really talking about what it is, identifying the issues, and identifying those key action items, I agree, is so important for everyone. But just to quickly wrap things up with a real rapid fire last check-in here, but you're speaking to an audience of business leaders from all sectors. So I'm wondering what your top piece of advice might be for them as they're looking to take further action on climate change. Caroline, I'd love to start with you.
Sure, thanks. Well, I think it's really clear that more and more investors are acknowledging that climate risk is market risk, right? And actually, we know that some of the standard setting boards, in particular, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, has been evaluating standard setting activities in relation to alternative proteins for food and beverage companies. And I expect we'll see a lot more focus on this from investors and within the ESG space, not all too different from what we've seen in energy over the last several years. And a hedge fund we were recently speaking to, I might not get this quote exactly right, but said to us that, they believe the risk to companies of, and this is a huge hedge fund, of not offering alternative meat and dairy products is actually potentially fatal, given both changing consumer preferences and the need to decarbonize and to do so quickly, that traditional meat or dairy products could be left behind as stranded assets. So some pretty serious words to consider.
That's the first time I've heard the term stranded assets used to describe food products, but that's definitely super interesting. And, I'm wondering if we'll hear more about that. That's I'll have to look that one up, and everybody in the audience will all have to do the same. But Rebecca, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about really what your big piece of advice is for business leaders out there.
That is a great report. If I'm thinking about the same one, it's definitely worth a read. I think my advice is this is solvable. We talk about doom and gloom, but it's eminently solvable. We just have to rally to do it. We have to address animal farming. We have to address and disrupt global demand for cattle products in particular, but especially luxury consumption in wealthy countries. We don't need to eat this, so let's not. Let's find other ways of feeding that demand. I don't think policy is going to do it. I don't think we're going to see, every NDC start addressing this. So private sector is critical. If you as a business leader can connect your climate values to your procurement, to your employee sustainability communications, your carbon action plan, bring meat into the conversation. If you're still serving meat from cows and you have firm climate commitments, there's a lot of opportunity to start changing direction of travel here.
Well, thank you both so much for your perspectives. I think that, as you've both said, and if anybody gets anything from this today, I think that it's just really, these issues are solvable, but we have to identify them and we have to really take action. So thank you so much for sharing your perspectives with us. This was really so great, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So finally, we are going to be sitting down with Jamie Luchek, who is the Senior Brand Manager of Tazo Tea, and Deandra Morissette and Sabs Katz, who are co-founders of Intersectional Environmentalists, and we'll be talking all about climate justice. So thank you, ladies, so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really excited to get things going. So first, Deandra, I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about who Intersectional Environmentalist is and some of the work that you do.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for having us. We're really excited to be here and share a little bit more about what we do and some of the cool stuff that we've been able to do with the Tazo team. So Intersectional Environmentalist, or IE for short, is a community and resource hub that is here to help build the next generation of intersectional environmentalists. And we do that through educational resources and events that really seek to amplify and center intersectional perspectives in the environmental movement. And we do this by bringing a significance of identity and culture within our environmental stewardship to the forefront of these conversations. And we've been able to help a lot of our community find joy in reclaiming their heritage and their backgrounds in these environmental conversations. And we also curate and provide free, accessible resources. We develop this educational programming. And again, we host these events to ultimately empower our community with the tools that they need to take action in their own ways, whether that be through the lens of their fields of study, their career paths, their personal hobbies and passions, and ultimately through local advocacy.
Thank you so much for that intro. And we know we've referred to this a little bit, I think, earlier in the program, but that climate change and the climate crisis are not felt by everyone equally. And Sams, I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about some of the reasons why communities of color in particular tend to be disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change.
Yeah, so when we look at the climate crisis and who it's most impacting, we're seeing there's a large correlation between harmful social constructs like sexism and racism, which disproportionately target certain communities, whether that's through the increase in rates of asthma in Black and Brown communities, or the increase in climate refugees, or the development of pipelines such as Line 3, which puts Indigenous communities at risk. And as an organization, we at IE are working to bring a lot of these issues and conversations to the forefront of environmentalism. Just one example of a statistic pulled from, to kind of confirm a lot of these issues is from 2019, which found that white Americans experienced around 17% less air pollution exposure than they caused. Meanwhile, Black and Latinx communities average a quote unquote pollution burden of around 60% excess exposure. And that just means 60% more pollution than their communities even caused. So these are just a few reasons why it's so important for us to address and listen to and center the voices from these frontline communities in order for us to really understand why these harmful social constructs and systems would target them so unjustly.
I think that's such an important point to make, right? Yes, absolutely. And like such an important point to make about who is causing the significance, like the most impacts, and who is bearing the brunt of these, right? Whether you're talking about developed markets like the US or globally, we really see that the populations that are causing the greatest impacts are not those that are bearing the most significant brunt of those impacts, right? And Jamie, Tazo Teak came out with a really bold statement around this last year saying, we are taking a stand for climate justice. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that and what it means for you.
Sure. Thank you so much. We understand that the climate crisis isn't a threat, something that's coming in the future. Not only is it here now, it has been impacting communities for decades. And as Sabs just said, it's disproportionately impacting communities of color, lower income communities. And I think we saw that so tragically right now with Hurricane Ida. I mean, you ask, why can't somebody evacuate? Potentially they don't have the means. How is a hurricane traveling all the way from the Gulf Coast through inland, up through New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and still dumping record rainfalls and causing dozens of lives to be lost? We realized that the sense of urgency was dire, and the justice piece of climate work was so critical.
Absolutely. And you're working with groups like Intersectional Environmentalists around this issue. Can you tell us a bit more about that work?
Certainly. So we're experts at Tazo in making tea. We are not experts in climate change, social justice. So we sought out the people that were, and we were so fortunate to be able to partner with groups like American Forests, We Act for Environmental Justice, and of course, Intersectional Environmentalist. And in fact, we were able to participate in their first ever brand accountability program. And this was a training course, essentially a training course, where we were able to really sit and turn that lens internally and to understand how in our conversations at work are we missing the opportunity to center the marginalized communities that have been bearing the burden of business as usual for so long. And then perhaps most rewardingly, we were able to fund in a paid internship program where they were able to offer their interns a living wage.
That's so fantastic, and really excited to dive into that a little bit more here. But some people might hear something where it's like, okay, internships, climate justice, how are these two things connected, right? And Sabs, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but can you tell us a bit more about why it's so important for people from the communities that are most impacted by climate change to really have their voices heard in these conversations?
Absolutely. So intersectional environmentalism quite literally advocates for the protection of people and the planet, and that includes the well-being of humans in the professional sector as well. So offering things like paid internships, in doing so, we can really influence other industries to prioritize these diverse voices that are so needed for an equitable future. as many of us know, the climate crisis is the largest issue that younger generations are facing. So providing jobs that advocate for intersectional environmentalism and climate justice allows these young professionals to really combine their passion with their professional skills. And, we're here to help them grow, whether that's opportunities for mentorship, training, networking, and learning. And I think overall, we just hope IE can serve as a model for transparency, for equality, and for care for our team.
That's so great. Thank you for sharing that. And the first cohort of these interns has actually gone through the program. Is that correct? And Deandra, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how that went.
Yeah, absolutely. The internship program was incredible. It really was an opportunity that changed the course of IE's future, not only for just us as an organization, but for all of our interns as well. As a small grassroots effort that was just getting started a little over a year and a half ago, we knew that funding was going to be a challenge, but the Tazo team came to us and asked us what we needed to create the educational resources, the access, and the impact that we knew we could have. And with an understanding that environmental justice work is so often underpaid or not paid at all, we wanted to be able to fund an internship program that would create space for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and particularly youth, to flex their skills in this work with us while being paid. So we had interns ranging from communications to design to animation, operations, research, finance, so really spanning the business sector. And one of the most impactful things that came out of the internship program was the creation of an intersectional history on environmentalism video. And it tied in the expertise of all of our interns, and they created this incredible piece of media that universities and organizations and even Kerry Washington has shared at this point. That was kind of exciting. And it was so beautiful to see how they all contributed their skills across everything that I just listed. And now some of our interns have gone off to do incredible things like work for Netflix, Global Health Corp, and more. And we're excited to continue working with them.
That is so fabulous. Love the dog cameo as well. But I'm such a huge Kerry Washington fan, so I would have been so excited about that also. But I'm wondering, Jamie, if you could tell us a little bit about how it was like for Tazo in terms of dealing with and working with these young leaders and future leaders of the climate movement.
It was just really inspiring to see the work that they were able to put together, and to know that we had a small piece in, fostering that was very rewarding. As both Sabs and Deandra mentioned, these are young professionals just starting on their journey in environmentalism, and their take on things is so critical. And to have that opportunity was key. So we are really privileged to have been able to offer that paid internship. And we also learned that it's important as a business, when working with our grassroots nonprofits, to say, what is it that you do need, not to make assumptions and not to come with our own mission, but instead to help foster theirs.
Absolutely. Yes. I hope all of the brand leaders out there are listening right now. Is it really, when it comes to, we hear this so many times when we're doing our reporting, is that when you're working with grassroots groups, community groups, they know their communities so well. They will know what's best about what they really need and how they're going to be able to make that impact that they really want to have. So love that you mentioned that. And as we're wrapping up our conversation here, I'd love to hear from all of you, if you kind of an action item or two for the broader business community about pushing climate justice forward. How can we go about doing this? And Deandra, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, we'll see if we get another cameo from my dog here. But I think that right now we do have a really urgent shift that needs to happen, both within, the narrative of the environmental movement, but also a shift in how we fund it. So I alluded to this earlier, but not only can businesses really provide teams with, the face time and the tools and the resources that we need to better understand why intersectionality is an important lens for environmental justice, but there's also a huge opportunity to address the large disparity between the funding that general environmental efforts receive versus more targeted environmental justice efforts that will ultimately empower us all to fight the climate crisis together.
Absolutely. And Sab, same question.
Yeah, so kind of, just reiterating everything Deandra said, I think committing to wealth distribution is especially important for grassroots environmental justice organizations. Unfortunately, not everyone can be an expert in climate justice, but everyone can be a part of the solution. And, we all have a role to play in this movement. So, we want to encourage businesses to go beyond just the bare minimum of wealth distribution. In just over a year at IE, we have been able to distribute over 10% of all of our funding to, various environmental justice initiatives. So we really want to encourage other large organizations to continue funding and distributing wealth in this way.
Absolutely. I love what you're saying about how we can't all be experts, but we can all do something. Every single one of us can do something about this, right? I hope everyone's hearing that. But Jamie, what are your thoughts on those big action items out there for the business world?
Yeah, so I mean, we heard the president say just yesterday that this is code red for the environment. So my first piece of advice to my fellow business leaders is to take action immediately. If you're thinking that this is something that you can workshop or put off, I would encourage you instead to just start today by saying who's already out there working on something. As we did, we found a wonderful partner with intersectional environmentalists, and we were able to help unlock further growth for them. And that would be my ambition for each of you listening today, is to find those partners and help fund those missions to bring more good in the world.
And get started now. Absolutely. Thank you all so much for being with us. This was so great, and we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for today, everyone. Thank you again for being with us for this latest edition of 3BL Forum Brands Taking Stands. We'll be covering climate change, climate justice, a lot of these issues on Triple Pundit during Climate Week and in the lead up to COP26. So be sure to check that out. And to stay updated on more events like this, go to 3blforum.com and sign up for email updates. Thanks so much again for being with us, and I'll see you next time.